Hi, my name's Daryl, and if you're in the market for a used Wrangler, man, have I got a good video for you. Today, I'm going to show you how to inspect a Jeep Wrangler in 10 easy steps. Now, before we get started, let's talk about some of the items you'll need. First is you're going to need a flashlight. Second, you're going to want a small mirror and then some measuring tape. Now, the first step is to research the Wrangler that you want to purchase. And the best way to do that is by using Carfax. Ideally, you want to find a good 1 or 2 owner car that hasn't been a rental, has good service records with regular oil changes, and no serious accidents. I would really recommend avoiding the early JLs in the 2018 and 2019 years, as they had some steering pump recall issues and also some steering stabilizer issues, as well as steering mounts. Also, in regards to engines, I'd avoid both the 4xe and the Echo diesel engines and stick with the 2-liter turbo and the 3.6-liter penestar. And lastly, I tried to find a Wrangler that is as stock as possible. No engine modifications, no super big lifts, and no huge tires. Okay, on to step 2 where we inspect the car. We're going to start with the exterior. Now, all Wrangler JLs, they have the potential to have a corrosion issue. I did a video on the problem, and it's primarily caused by moisture getting underneath the hinges and in the body panel seams. What you want to do is closely inspect all the hinges on the doors, the hoods, and the tailgate, and also inspect the seams. What you're looking for is a little bubbles, or bubbles that are kind of raised underneath the paint. Sometimes it's easier to run your hands over the areas and you can easily feel the bubbles. If you find corrosion and the vehicle is past its 5-year corrosion warranty, I would just move on. You also want to look for any pinstriping in the paint for when they took the vehicle off-road and got some bush pinstriping or mismatched paint that might show signs of an accident. I'd also pay attention to any fading on the plastic on the fender flares, the convertible top, or the hardtop, as that shows it's been left out in the sun and has not been maintained. Okay, on to step 3, where we need to check for an aftermarket lift and oversized tires. Now, I know that a lifted Wrangler, it looks really cool, right? But many lift brands, they just don't simply provide a complete lift kit, which can cause steering problems, i.e. death wobble, and other suspension nightmares. Also, larger tires, 35s or 37s, they can put strain on the drivetrain, causing premature failure unless higher ratio gears were installed. Now, I'd really recommend backing off any lift, but for sure, anything over 2 inches, I'd strongly recommend walking away. Now, the best way of determining the height of the lift is by measuring the top of the axle tube to the bottom of the upper spring lip. The stock measurement is 10 7/8 inches, or about 11 inches. So, you know, if you've got 13 inches on your measurement, yeah, that's going to be a problem. Now, in regards to tires, you really should know the stock tire that came on your Jeep. Now, you can get this from Carfax by clicking on the original window sticker within Carfax. Now, most Sport and Sahara trims, they came with 31-inch tires and can pretty much easily be, upgraded or oversized to 33s without issue. The problem is on that Sahara or on that Sport, when you go from 31s to 35s. That will typically require some sort of lift as well as a gear change. Now, the Rubicons, they come stock with 33-inch tires, but they do have an option for 35-inch tires from the factory with the X package. The Rubicons, if they came with 33-inch tires, and if it has a larger than 35-inch tire like 37s, I would really walk away. Lastly, check the tires for uneven wear in the tread, which could point to some problems in the alignment or the suspension. All right, so in step 4, this is where we get a little bit dirty, and so I don't think I mentioned this, but when you're going out to inspect your Wrangler, you need to get underneath the vehicle. This is where the flashlight will come in real handy. What you're looking for is any sort of oil leaks. Primarily the leaks will be coming from underneath the engine, typically the oil cooler, which will end up dripping oil onto the transmission. If the car has overheated, you might also see signs of coolant underneath the vehicle. You also want to pay attention to any sort of oil on the axle seals. And when you're underneath there, look for any obvious dings from off-roading where the differential might have gotten scraped. Obviously, Wranglers are meant to go off-roading, but personally, I'd prefer a mall crawler for my money. Now, the JLs haven't been known to have too many issues with rust, but it's worthwhile to also look at the frame for any obvious signs of rust damage. So in step number 5, we get to check the engine. So you're going to open up the hood, and for shits and giggles, I check to ensure that the fluids are full, including the oil level, the radiator reservoir, the brake fluid, as well as the steering fluid. Look for any signs of engine modifications, especially like a bolted-on supercharger. Jeepers also love to add accessories like lights and things to the Wrangler, but I'd look for any electrical work that really looks shoddy, as well as multiple additional connections to the battery. You're also going to want to take the engine cover off and look for any obvious signs of oil leaks. You know, again, having a flashlight and mirror will be really helpful. Now, on the 3.6 Penestar engine, the engine cover just came right off. On the 2-liter turbo, you actually have two 10mm bolts that you have to remove off the front of the cover, and then you can pull it right off. You also want to smell for anything unusual. Really use your nose and notice if there are any unusual smells of like oil, gas, or antifreeze. You also want to check the belts for any signs of wear, like white cords showing through them. You want to check the radiator condenser and ensure it's not full of bugs, crushed from an accident. It should be nice and clean in there. Finally, have the sales guy start the engine. You know, make sure before you do that, go to the back and check the exhaust for like thick white or blue or gray or black smoke, which would be indication of some sort of problems with the engine. Then go to the engine and listen for any unusual noises at startup. Both the turbo and the Penestar can have a valve train noise. But once it warms up, they should go away. Now, I did a video on the Penestar tick, which is a common problem with the rocker arms. Make sure you pay attention to any loud ticking noise that persists on the V6 Penestar. Let the car warm up and just pay attention to any unusual noises or smells. One additional thing, I really recommend when checking the engine that you use some sort of OBD scanner tool. So I've got multiple little scanners here, and you want to do that and check for any trouble codes. Now, I'd especially do this if you're purchasing from a private party or a small used car dealership. Now, if you don't have a scanner, actually, Jeep gives you this really great startup procedure, which will let you know that the Jeep is ready for a smog, and likely the codes haven't been cleared. So all you do is you hit the start button twice, what puts it kind of into run mode. The ignition doesn't turn on, but it basically just is in run mode. So you do that twice, okay? And you will see the check engine light come on. When the check engine light is on, it'll stay on for about 15 seconds or so. Either one of two things will happen. Either it starts blinking, and if it starts blinking, that means that somebody has cleared the codes and it's not ready for emissions. If the check engine light, however, stays solid, then you know it's ready for smog and likely any codes haven't been cleared. Okay, so now that we're inside the Jeep, let's move on to step 6, which is basically to make sure everything works kind of as you're sitting here. Everything that you would typically use, you know, the multimedia touchscreen, air conditioning, the heater, the turn signals, the brake lights, the headlights, the interior lights, just take the time to go through everything in the vehicle that you would typically use and make sure everything works as you would expect. All right, so on to step 7, and that's to check the interior. Now, one of the things I kind of always look on a Wrangler is for the saggy nets on the pocket door. It kind of just drives me crazy, and it's kind of a sign that they really didn't take care of their Wrangler. Also look for crumpling seats on the driver's side. It's kind of where your butt hits the seat, especially if it's lifted. You're going to see a little bit of a crumpling. Now, the visors on the Wranglers, they really suck, so check to make sure those works, and just the whole interior for any, you know, signs of neglect. All right, so we're on to step 8, which is test driving the Jeep. So we're going to go ahead and start up the Jeep. And of course, what you're going to be paying attention to is any sort of trouble codes that show up, or the check engine light that would show up in the instrument cluster. So barring any of that, one of the other potential warning lights is the auto stop start system warning light coming up, and I'll show you a display of that. Now, often what happens, there's actually two batteries in most Jeeps. You've got the primary battery and you have the auxiliary battery. Should the auxiliary battery start to go bad, which happens actually pretty occasionally, I would say every 3 or 4 years, you might have to replace that. That's what happens, is that auto stop start signal will come up, meaning your auto stop start won't be working, and that's the reason for it. And so you're definitely, if that comes up, you're definitely going to want to get that fixed before you purchase the Jeep. So the next thing you want to do on the test drive is to make sure that the four-wheel drive system is working properly. Now, everybody supposedly buys Jeeps for their off-road abilities, but a lot of folks are a little intimidated by the transfer case and switching into 4 high and 4 low. So a lot of people just don't use it. And if you don't use it, there might be some problems with the four-wheel drive system. And so if you're a little intimidated, just ask the sales guy if he knows how to use it or somebody else knows how to use it, but don't, walk away from that Jeep without making sure that the four-wheel drive system works. So basically, it's really easy to go from 2 high to 4 high. 4 high is like the four-wheel drive, kind of at higher speeds. And if you have it in drive, all you have to do is just take it from 2 high and then put it in 4 high. And so the system is made to go back and forth between 2 high and 4 high without doing anything. Now, if you want to go into 4 low, you actually have to take the transmission and you have to put it in neutral. Once it's in neutral, you can then take that gear selector and move it to the right and then go down to put it into 4 low. And you're going to notice that when you're in 4 low, the lights will illuminate on the four-wheel drive selection system. And so now you're in 4 low. Now, to test the system, all you really have to do, and a lot of folks will say that you really shouldn't use it at all on pavement, but you can just go real quickly. And what's going to happen is when you drive with it in 4 low, and if you kind of make just a slight turn, you're going to feel the steering wheel kind of bind a little bit. And that basically means that the four-wheel drive system is working as it should. So then you can go ahead and put it back into regular drive mode and then continue with your test drive. Now what we're going to do is just kind of drive normally. Now you want to pay attention to any sort of kind of unusual noises, any unusual kind of smells, any sort of clunking or anything that doesn't sound normal. I will say in the 4-cylinder turbo, you'll kind of hear a little turbo whine, and that's just totally normal. But make sure that the transmission shifts without any serious jerking. Make sure it accelerates the way you would expect. You kind of want to do a little acceleration while the engine's still cold, and then also do one while the engine's still warm. Now I gotta say, the transmission, it is a super 8-speed automatic transmission with hardly ever any troubles, but still you need to pay attention to make sure that that's working like it should. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to do is feel the steering. Now, Jeeps do steer a little bit different from your typical SUV. The steering is just, it's not quite as sharp as other vehicles, but the Jeep shouldn't wander. The steering wheel should, not have a whole lot of play in it. Shouldn't feel dangerous, but certainly, make sure that the steering feels solid, that there's not a whole lot of play, and that the Jeep doesn't wander around, just all over the road, because that is not normal for a Wrangler JL. The other thing that you're going to want to do is just test the braking. I would actually do some hard braking if you can, just to make sure that there's no squeaking, that the braking reacts the way it should. Now, sometimes if people put larger tires on the Jeeps, you get a lot more weight, a lot of accessories, a winch. Sometimes that Jeep gets really heavy and the brakes aren't appropriate and they haven't upgraded the brakes, but make sure that it brakes as you would expect. Now, you're going to want to do some driving both on the highway as well as the city. So I'm currently in the city. But just, take your time, let the salesman, kind of know that you just want to get a feel for the Jeep and make sure it's for you. And so, make sure you put enough mileage on the Jeep to get comfortable with it and make sure everything works as it should. Now, one other really important thing that you do when you're test driving your Jeep is checking to make sure that the steering components and the suspension components, are really solid. So the Jeep has a front solid axle, which makes it somewhat prone to something called death wobble, which is basically kind of an oscillation of those steering and suspension components that, when those front wheels, when it hits an imperfection in the road, and if something is loose, things will start kind of wobbling. They call it death wobble. And I can't say it's necessarily normal for a Jeep. It's normal for, any sort of solid axle vehicle. But it's really important to test for that. So what you want to do is, as you're driving to the dealership, find some areas on the road that has some imperfections. It could be a manhole cover, it could be, kind of anything that causes those front wheels to kind of jump a little bit. And what you want to do is take that at speed. And when you take that at speed, if you're having any problems with those components, you'll start to feel those wheels kind of wobble, and it really won't stop until your Jeep comes to a complete stop. So that's one really important thing to check for when you're test driving a Jeep. Now, the last thing that you want to check for, Jeeps sometimes, can have a problem with overheating, as really any car can. But when you're test driving the Jeep, both, on the highway and also in the city, just pay attention to that temperature gauge. So really, it shouldn't really go pretty much above that center line on the temperature gauge. And if it does, you might have a little bit of a problem. The other thing that you can do is you can turn on the actual temperature gauge in the instrument cluster, so it shows you the exact temperature. So I'm going to scroll through that until I get to the vehicle information page, and then I can bring up the coolant temperature. So right now I'm at 192. Now, you really shouldn't see too much any temperatures over about 220 degrees. Pretty much at that temperature, you'll hear the fan kick on, and then it'll start to lower that temperature again really fast. If you see it consistently above that 220 and really going higher than that and not getting down lower beneath that, then that Jeep probably has an issue with some sort of problem with the cooling system. And now we're on to step 9. So after the test drive, we really got to get underneath the Jeep again, because you've took the time to drive it. The engine's been warmed up, you drove it around a little bit, so now you need to recheck again, because as you drive and it warms up, things kind of shift, things expand and contract, and you want to make sure that now when you're underneath the Jeep that there's nothing leaking. You also want to open the hood again, check also for any sort of leaks in there, check for any unusual smells or any sort of unusual sounds. Now, in step number 10, and this is pretty much it, I'd really highly recommend, even though we've done this inspection process, that you get a third-party pre-purchase inspection. Let the dealer know that everything looks great and you're really ready to buy, but you want to take it to a mechanic because you're, not the best automobile person, just to give you a little more peace of mind. And lastly, if you do purchase and the vehicle is still within its 5-year powertrain warranty, I'd also strongly recommend purchasing an extended warranty from Grainger Motors. It's a lot cheaper than getting it through your dealer, and it's still the same true Mopar warranty. So I really hope this helped, and good luck in purchasing your Wrangler.